Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined once again by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate the Great Jahnke. We are live once again on the YouTubes and the Twitterverse. We weren't last week, but we are back here this week, thanks to StreamYard cooperating. Round one of the fantasy football playoffs are officially wrapped. Nate, another wild week in the NFL, a bunch of quarterback injuries, some running back injuries as well, just all the madness that we can expect from this first week of the fantasy football playoffs. So how are you, good sir?
Doing fine. My leagues were a mix of teams doing really well if I had Josh Allen, or completely crashing and burning like Scott Fishbowl. I think half of my running backs got injured at some point during the game, and I finished like third to last out of the teams in the playoffs this past week, so will not be advancing there.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is, right? Like it all comes down to the 1 week, and you just need everything to go right. And some leagues that works out, we're in enough of them that sometimes we get through in enough. But then, sometimes the ones we care about the most are the ones we lost. I was a bit of a split as well. Won most, but there's always a few that are kind of frustrating, right? Like Jalen Waddle getting 0 points and things like that are killers. So we try to manage, and we just got to win 2 more. That's all it takes, and hopefully we're still alive to be able to do that. But we're going to do our waiver wire targets for those of you that are still alive in the fantasy playoffs, and you can reference Nate's waiver wire article on pff.com, which you can get access to along with many other valuable tools and resources with a PFF Plus subscription. And then we'll answer your questions in the chat as we go, and as they relate to the position groups that we're covering. Otherwise, we will hold them till the end. But we do have a quick comment here saying Devontae is MVP. I mean, of week 1 of the fantasy football playoffs, it might be hard to argue that. I mean, Mike Evans has an argument as well. There were a lot of stars this first week, and then naturally a lot of duds as well. But let's talk about some waiver wire targets here, Nate. And we'll start with our running backs as usual. And the first name on the list is Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints. Alvin Kamara, he scored a beautiful receiving touchdown, but unfortunately suffered a groin injury as well. So there's a lot to like about Kendre Miller here in week 16 if Alvin Kamara is out next week.
A number of injuries to running backs this past week that have given us a couple of options at running back. Miller is the one that I have at the top of my list, even though Alvin Kamara, we aren't clear how long he'll be out for. Right now, it seems like he's day-to-day. A chance he'll play this week, a chance he might not play this week. Also complicates things that he's playing on Monday Night Football. But throughout the season, when Miller's been healthy, he has been the very clear number 2 running back. Jamal Williams has barely played all season long, just a couple snaps here and there. And when Kamara went down with this injury, it was Miller taking over basically all of the reps. So the reason that Miller is at the top of this list for running backs, even though there's those questionable situations of maybe Alvin Kamara is back this week, maybe with Monday Night Football, you wouldn't be able to know if Miller's starting or not until it's too late. But I still think Miller has such a high potential, with Alvin Kamara being the, I think, RB3 right now in terms of fantasy points per games. Miller would slide right into that role of being the every down back, the guy that they need to feature in the offense, because they've had the injury to Taysom Hill. They've had the injuries to the wide receivers for a while now. They do not have many weapons, so they are relying heavily at the running back position, and I think they would do that with Miller. So even though some of the other running backs we'll talk about are more likely to see a decent amount of playing time, I think Miller is more likely to fit into that league winner situation. So if you are more in an okay position at running back and are just looking for that high upside league winner potential, Miller is the clear running back that I would be targeting right now.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like it's definitely tricky, like you said. Like they play on Monday Night Football this week, so ideally we'll get some clarity on Kamara's availability before then, so we know whether or not it's safe to start Miller for sure. But I mean, definitely should be added at this point, rostered for all the reasons that you just said. So, okay, as we know, another running back injury. Nick Chubb is officially done for the season with a broken foot. Really feel bad for Chubb, who battled back to play this season from that terrible knee injury. Now he won't even get a chance to finish the year. So as a result, though, Jerome Ford sees an expected increase in usage here for the rest of the year, Nate.
Yeah, Ford is someone who we've had on this list in recent weeks because the Browns' schedule is pretty rough in that they play some very good teams, and that favored Ford in general because he's been the receiving back. And in those games where they're playing from behind, Ford would be the running back on the field. And that was even similar this week. Even when Chubb had his injury, it was in a situation where the Browns were starting to lose and needed to throw the ball a lot. So Ford was likely to see a lot of playing time over the rest of that game anyway. So we expect Ford to be the clear running back. He was seeing over 75% of offensive snaps at times early in the season. I am slightly concerned that Deontay Foreman, who has been a healthy and active for several weeks now, will jump right back into early down role and take at least some of those snaps, or even take all of the snaps that Chubb was seeing before. So there's at least that possibility. I do think Ford will at least see a decent amount of volume, run the ball upwards of 10 carries, maybe even more, and still have a couple of receptions each week. So he is going to be that kind of borderline RB2. So if you have been needing a running back, I think Ford is a fine option. I also think we're at a point in the season where you want to be strategic about who is and isn't on your bench. If someone isn't going to start for you the rest of the year and also isn't going to help any of your opponents, it's fine to drop them. So also fine picking up Ford in case you think one of your upcoming opponents might need a running back and you can prevent them from getting Ford.
Yeah, it was nice to see. I mean, Ford had that 62-yard touchdown run. That was definitely encouraging. Hopefully gives, the coaching staff a little bit more encouragement to start him. And we saw him get a little bit of work in the pass game, like you said, a couple of catches in there. So definitely important for a running back on a team that is likely going to have to pass a lot. I think they play the Bengals this week, so could be trailing there as well, and has an opportunity to add some receptions to his stat total. Okay, Tajay Spears of the Tennessee Titans is up next, Nate. We know Tony Pollard has been a little banged up, but even with him in the lineup, Spears is getting some work and even scored a touchdown this past week.
Oh yeah, Pollard was on the injury report last week, wasn't able to practice a bit. We weren't positive he was going to play until about Saturday. And even then, in this game, he looked banged up at times, particularly in the second quarter, limping here and there. So we saw Spears see significant work. Part of this also could have very well been the game script, Tennessee playing behind multiple scores. And when that's happened, we've seen Spears be the primary running back as well when he has been healthy. So we saw Spears get a lot of the work, all of the third downs and 2-minute drill, which isn't too surprising, but also a significant amount of work on early downs. So I think we'll keep an eye on Pollard's injury. I think the big thing for me is because Tennessee is out of the playoff picture, they should be a little more likely to shut down Pollard at this point if he's not at 100%. And Spears really hasn't been given a ton of opportunities this year. And the big thing is the Titans play the Indianapolis Colts and Jacksonville Jaguars, two teams that have allowed a lot of fantasy points to running backs this season. We've seen it before when Tennessee has faced these opponents. So I think if Pollard were to miss time, we could see Spears in a role where he's playing upwards of 80% of offensive snaps. They were perfectly fine with Tony Pollard in that role when Spears has missed time. So I think Spears could be one of those must-start players. If they do shut down Pollard, it's just not the most likely thing that they do shut him down. But there's also a chance that Pollard could re-aggravate his injury again this upcoming week. So picking him up now for potentially the fantasy championship round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, like you said, maybe it's not the most likely that they shut down Pollard, but it's not impossible either at this point in the season, considering their record. And yeah, just Pollard not being 100% healthy and giving Spears an opportunity here. So I think it makes sense to add Spears, even if you're blocking somebody from getting him, whether it's the Tony Pollard manager or whoever. So okay, it's time to talk about Sincere McCormick again. Nate, we just saw him on Monday Night Football last night, but he suffered an ankle injury in that game and did not return. Otherwise, he'd likely be higher on this list.
Yeah, he got a lot of usage when he was healthy in this game. Ran the ball 7 times over the first 3 drives, also had 2 receptions. So it was really good to see him get involved in the passing game. Was not all that effective on his runs, which was a little disappointing, but it was good to see him have that clear early down role, even with Alexander Madison back. The coach had said that would be the case heading into the game, but it's always good to see it on the field as well. But it was an ankle injury. He was ruled out at halftime, so that wasn't a great sign. We're recording this, 12-ish hours since the injury happened, so we haven't got a lot of news of the extent of the injury. If we do find out that he is perfectly fine and he'll be ready to go next week, would probably move him up to about second on this list. But obviously, if he is something like week to week, then he can be dropped from the leagues that he was already picked up on, because week to week at this point basically means out for the fantasy season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's too bad because I mean he was, like you said, he was essentially the focal point of their offense there when he was in the game. He wasn't like doing a whole lot with it this week, but the snaps and the touches were there, and we've seen him, perform well in the previous week. So hopefully he's back in there, but I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. Okay, how about Tank Bigsby, Nate? Because we previously saw a pretty even distribution of snaps between him and Travis Etienne. The touches were sometimes tilted in Bigsby's direction. A little different this week in favor of Etienne, but Bigsby continues to stay involved.
Yeah, a little disappointing to see after Bigsby had the 16 or 18 carries the week before compared to 4 by ETN. And this week, both running backs had double-digit carries, which was good to see. We've seen that a couple of times throughout this year, where both running backs would get heavily involved in the run game. So while Bigsby does not have quite the same amount of upside that he had a week ago, he is still someone where if you are more desperate for a running back for your starting lineup and aren't able to get one of these players that we talked about before, or the players we talked about before just aren't starting, I think Bigsby is at least someone that can fit into your fantasy lineup. Jacksonville faces the Raiders and the Titans over the next 2 weeks. So 2 teams where they should be able to stick with the run game, not have to abandon the run like we've seen in other games where opponents are blowing out the Jaguars. So I think Bigsby is someone who is pretty safe to see double-digit carries these next few weeks. So just kind of a safer option if you are in need of a safe option. But if you are pretty well set at running back, Bigsby is probably not someone that I would look to add to my bench.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kamani Vidal of the Los Angeles Chargers is up next, Nate. Just 3 carries for 9 yards this week, but he saw 3 targets and caught 2 for 13 yards. So does Vidal at least have the receiving role in this Chargers backfield?
Yeah, he was playing all of the third down snaps, all of the 2-minute drill snaps. So it was good to see him get pretty heavily involved in this game. So even on early downs, he was playing over 50% of the offensive snaps, which was pretty impressive to see. Gus Edwards still had the majority of the carries. The Chargers were not running a lot in this game. And at least right now, it is a short week against the Denver Broncos. Probably not trusting him too much in this matchup, but I would pick him up now potentially for the fantasy championship round where they face the New England Patriots, potentially in the cold weather. I don't remember if it's home or away, so I might be making that up right now. But against the Patriots, at least, it's an opponent where they should be running the ball a lot. So if we do see Vidal continue to see a lot of the playing time and hopefully run the ball more than 3 times this week, we can see him get a significant workload against the Patriots.
Yeah, and it's in New England. So yeah, should be colder
okay.
weather than Los Angeles for sure. All right. And then lastly, Kenneth Gainwell continues to operate as Saquon Barkley's handcuff, Nate.
Yeah, he has been playing well throughout the season and has limited opportunities. He has consistently been on this list for the past month or two, just because if something were to happen to Saquon Barkley, then Gainwell would have a huge role in an offense that likes to run the ball with a good offensive line. Faces the Cowboys in Week 17, so a team where they would be able to run the ball a lot and have a lot of success against, because the Cowboys have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. So while we have no reason to believe whatsoever right now that Barkley is dealing with any injury, I wanted to leave at least the one clear handcuff where if you just have that bottom roster spot that you're not sure what to do with, Gainwell is a fine player to just stick on your roster, see what happens in 1 week. And if Barkley doesn't suffer an injury, then you can always drop Gainwell next week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, look, he also played like a season high 31 offensive snaps this week too. Like I think the other possibility is, like, I wouldn't be surprised if the Eagles just give him a little more work as well, just to make sure that they don't lean too heavily on Barkley heading into the playoffs so that they can keep him healthy. But yeah, there's at least some maybe some value there in Kenneth Gainwell for those super deep leagues, even if Barkley's healthy. All right, let's go to the wide receivers now. And how can we not start with Mr. Primetime, Romeo Doubs, scoring 2 touchdowns on Sunday Night Football, Nate? I think we literally talked about some positive regression in the touchdown column, like maybe last week, and he delivered in a big way this week.
Yeah, even had another end zone target where it was just a little bit of a miscommunication there. So Dobbs very well could have had 3 touchdowns in this game. So that was very good to see. He returned after missing the 2 weeks with the concussion. His playing time returned almost completely back to normal, which was good to see. Didn't see a ton of targets, but the big thing with Dobbs is one, he has been the most reliable wide receiver who's available on the waiver wire. Every other wide receiver has either scored fewer points than Dobbs over the course of the season or is injured right now. So Dobbs has been the most effective waiver wire wide receiver, and he has the best schedule of the wide receivers available. Faces the Saints and Vikings over the next 2 weeks, 2 teams that have allowed a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So I think Dobbs has the potential to continue to be in that wide receiver 3 range like he's been basically all season when he's been healthy.
Yeah, he looked great on that. I mean, that second touchdown catch was really nice. But yeah, now we just need some positive touchdown regression to come through for poor Trey McBride as well. All right, speaking of multi-touchdown scores from Sunday, Rashad Bateman brought in 2 of the 5 Lamar Jackson passing touchdowns this week as his career year continues in 2024.
Oh yeah, when I'm working on these waiver wire articles on Saturday, I'm going through and picking out the players that I wanted to or thought I'd be writing about. And Bateman was one of the players even before the 2 touchdowns, so it was pretty nice to see him score the 2 touchdowns. So it would be easier for me to convince people to pick him up. The big thing with him is throughout this season and basically throughout his career, he's been one of those high average depth of target players who doesn't see a super high target share. So even though he scores a decent amount of fantasy points over the season, it can be hard to trust him because it's hard to know when he's going to have these big games like we saw this past week. But the reason that I like him off the waiver wire is not so much this week where they face the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have been fairly good against wide receivers, and it'll be a fun matchup to watch because the Steelers and Ravens are always fun to watch. But the week after that, Ravens facing the Houston Texans, who haven't allowed the highest catch rate on deep passes this year, but are tied for the most deep passing touchdowns allowed by a defense. So I think Bateman has that potential to score again and potentially even twice. Probably not going to get that lucky, but I think he has at least the potential to have a big play or 2 against the Houston Texans in week 17. So if you're in a league where you start a lot of wide receivers or are just in a matchup where you are the clear underdog and need someone capable of having a big play or 2, then I think Bateman is worth considering.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, Lamar Jackson still trying to make his MVP case as well. So he's going to continue to throw some touchdowns, I imagine. As a Zay Flowers manager, I hated this one because I would have liked at least one of those 5 touchdowns to go to him. But I do like Rashad Bateman. So, what can you do? All right, let's move on to a name that doesn't annoy me. Jalen Coker is back, Nate, and he made his return with a bang, delivering an 83-yard touchdown and finishing the day with 110 receiving yards, doubling up Adam Thielen's receiving total, by the way. Just to remind everyone, that especially old man Thielen, that this is his team and he appreciates them keeping his throne warm for him while he was gone. So, Nate, how did the usage shake out for Coker with him back in the lineup?
It was good to see that the 2 players, Coker and Thielen, both got heavily involved in the offense. They had both been slot receivers throughout this year with Carolina and had never been active at the same time. So it wasn't exactly clear how they would shake out snaps between them. But basically what happened is at the start of the game, David Moore was on the bench. He had been a clear starter for the past several weeks. We had seen a couple weeks ago when Thielen came back that David Moore, who had been the X receiver, started moving more to a Z receiver role. So it wasn't surprising to see one of these receivers start to play more at the Z position. Early in the game, it was a pretty clear mix. sometimes Coker would line up in the slot. Other times it was Thielen in the slot, and the other would line up out wide. As the game progressed, it became more and more Thielen in the slot and Coker out wide. And then we also saw Xavier Legette suffer a groin injury in this game. So David Moore, who had been benched at the start of the game, went right back into the starting lineup. Legette, it sounds like he's week to week, so we could very well see David Moore starting again, which doesn't matter too much for this. I think Coker and Thielen will be the clear top 2 players in targets. We did see Thielen lead the team in targets and receptions, even though it was Coker who led the team in receiving yards. So I think both of them are capable of having big games. A pretty decent schedule, games against the Arizona Cardinals and Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which also helps them. But it's also an offense that hasn't really been able to sustain 2 fantasy relevant receivers all year. So there's a chance that one of the wide receivers could have a big game. The other wide receiver has a quiet game. I would be nice to see both of them have a big game at the same time, but I'm not sure that will happen. But I think if you are in need of a wide receiver that maybe is a little bit safer than Rashad Bateman, but has a little bit lower upside, I think Coker is a fine player to put in that wide receiver 3 spot if you are in need of a wide receiver.
Nice. All right. We talked about Jalen McMillan last week after he had a very nice 2-touchdown game. Well, he found the end zone again this week, very early in that game on Sunday. So Nate, the rookie wide receiver for the Bucs continues his strong play as of late.
Yeah, great to see him put together these 2 straight good games in a row after being having a pretty quiet start to the season and middle parts of the season as well. So even though I'm probably not trusting him in my fantasy starting lineup this week, I do think it's fine to at least pick him up, see how he does this week, potentially consider him in week 17. Faces the Carolina Panthers that week and also faces the Cowboys this week if you are in some very deep league and are in need of a wide receiver. I think it's okay to consider him. His playing well has meant we haven't seen as much of Cade Otton. Sterling Shepard also dealing with a little bit of injuries basically throughout the last several weeks. He's been at least dealing with something. So I think McMillan can be the number 2 wide receiver in this offense going forward. Probably only concern is considering they're facing the Cowboys and Panthers, they could just be running the ball a ton in those matchups as well. So in most leagues, probably not starting McMillan, but did want to include him for those of you who are in deeper leagues and could be looking for a wide receiver.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next up, we have Calvin Austin, the third, by the way, Calvin Austin, the third of the Pittsburgh Steelers. George Pickens has missed 2 straight games, so Austin has stepped up with some of the receiving production for that Steelers wide receiver core and saw a bigger role overall, Nate.
Yeah, it was good to see this week the Steelers switching up how they're using their wide receivers from one week to the next. Calvin Austin basically throughout the year has been the slot receiver for Pittsburgh, and even in recent weeks started to see some a little bit less playing time than usual, with Ben Skoranek coming off injured reserve and kind of rotating with Austin at times in the slot. This week, they decided to trust Austin a lot more, saw a much higher percentage of 11 personnel snaps, and also was one of the main wide receivers in 12 personnel as well. So something we hadn't seen a lot of this season was Austin in 2 wide receiver sets. The reason that I included him is even George Pickens is able to return, they could very well keep Austin in this bigger role. I don't think there's really a conflict between Austin and Pickens' role. It would just mean Austin playing ahead of Van Jefferson in 2 wide receiver sets and just staying ahead of Skoranek in the slot in 3 wide receiver sets. They face the Ravens this week, a team that has a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers. So especially if George Pickens has to miss another game, I think Austin could be a solid play this week. But even if Pickens does return, it was at least good to see and at least worth mentioning, even if it's not for this year. But it's possible Austin has earned himself one of those 3 wide receiver spots in Pittsburgh for next year.
Yeah, like you said, even if Pickens is back in there, like they just need someone else at wide receiver. Like literally anyone else will do at this point, because like outside of Pickens, their wide receivers, these guys have been pretty inconsistent. So maybe Austin can provide something there. We'll have to see. And lastly, Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders. We just saw him on Monday night as well. Another quieter game for him this week, but the playing time is still there for him, Nate.
Yeah, has been the clear number 2 wide receiver for the team. The team using a lot of 12 personnel, but that hasn't mattered. Tucker has clearly been on the field whenever they're in 2 wide receiver sets as well. Has had a couple of big games in there, an 82-yard with 7 catches a couple weeks ago, caught a 59-yard touchdown recently as well. The big thing is he faces the Jacksonville Jaguars next week. Jacksonville has given up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So if you are in a very deep league and are very desperate for a wide receiver, there's Tucker. And I at least wanted to mention him. So when he does have a good game, I can at least say that you should have picked him up, even though I probably will not be starting him in any of my lineups.
Fair. All right. I want to let you know that this show is sponsored by Fabric by Gerber Life. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay, let's talk about some tight ends. And a familiar name here earlier in the year back on our radar. It's Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars, because Evan Ingram is on IR. So Strange is back to being potentially one of the top targets in this Jaguars passing offense, Nate.
Oh, yeah, was the clear number 2 target this past week, caught 11 passes for 73 yards. We rarely see tight ends see that many receptions and that many targets in a game, something we typically only see out of guys like Brock Bowers, Travis Kelce, David Njoku, and Trey McBride. So Strange in some pretty great company at tight end this past week. I think we'll continue to see him see a lot of playing time like we saw earlier in the season when Ingram was out. I think he'll continue to be a clear top target on the team because unlike early in the season, they don't have Christian Kirk anymore. They don't have Gabe Davis anymore. So I think Strange will continue to see a very high target share, bring in a lot of those targets as well. I think he's capable of being a fantasy starter over these next 2 weeks. So while a lot of the players that we're talking about today might not be fantasy starters in a lot of leagues, I think Strange is someone who is capable of being a starter in a ton of leagues, someone you want to pick up, even if it's to prevent one of the other people in your league from picking him up. So I think Strange is probably one of the top waiver wire options this week. And they also play the Raiders next week. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends. So not only did he play well last week, he is also in a very good matchup this week.
Yeah, and last time that Ingram was out as well this season, it was 4 games. Strange finished as a top 10 PPR tight end in 3 of those 4 weeks. And then this week, like you said, it looks like he's probably top 3 this week with the 11 catches. So yeah, nice to see there for Brenton Strange. How about Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans, Nate? Because he definitely hasn't been like tearing it up this year, but getting a little more involved here in recent weeks.
Yeah, the Texans, basically all of their other tight ends are dealing with at least some kind of injury. Cade Stover, an emergency appendectomy on Saturday night, so that was a little surprising. And then they have 3 other tight ends on injured reserve. So they basically needed Schultz to be on the field for almost every play, which he was doing at times early in the season as well. And the other big thing here is even though he hasn't had a ton of big performances this year, the Texans are facing the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens over the next 2 weeks. 2 teams where they are going to have to throw the ball a lot. So Schultz will be running a ton of routes, could be one of the top 2 or 3 tight ends over these next 2 weeks in terms of routes run. So even if he's not seeing a huge target share, just the sure amount of volume he's running with routes, along with even a smaller target share, will lead to a decent amount of fantasy production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just looking at the schedule here, I just realized we got Saturday games back this week as well. 2 Saturday games, so that'll be fun. Yeah,
Texans Saturday games this week.
That's true. Yeah, Texans Chiefs, and that's a 1:00 Eastern, and Steelers Ravens for 4:30. Wow. All right, should be fun. And then lastly, for our tight ends, it's only right we continue to talk about New Orleans Saints tight ends. And Juwan Johnson is our guy right now, Nate. Not as exciting as Taysom Hill, but exciting enough when you consider the lack of receiving options for the Saints right now.
Yeah, with all the players that have been injured for the Saints, they've needed to throw the ball more to their tight ends. Foster Moreau, also someone who has done decently basically throughout the season, but Johnson has been a little bit more of the receiving tight end, even though I believe Moreau scored a touchdown this past week. Saints facing the Packers and Raiders over the next 2 weeks, two of the 8 teams that have allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends this year. So even though I'm not overly confident that Johnson will be able to produce in both of those games, I think there's at least that opportunity. So if you miss out on Strange and Schultz isn't available and you do need a tight end, like if you've had Kyle Pitts in your lineup throughout the season, then I think Johnson is someone who can slide into your starting lineup if you are very much in need for a tight end.
Yep. I definitely feel the pain there with Kyle Pitts. All right, let's talk some quarterbacks now, Nate, because there very well may be some fantasy managers in a desperate spot for a replacement, considering we got injuries now to Patrick Mahomes. Jameis got benched, so who knows what's going to happen there. Geno Smith has been another popular streamer. He's hurt now as well. So new names to be considered here in the fantasy playoffs, Nate, starting with Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, it has been a rough time for anyone who needs a quarterback off the waiver wire for the past couple months now. Had been talking about Will Levis for forever, and he got benched as well. Had been talking about Jameis Winston the last couple weeks. Had been talking about Daniel Jones for a number of weeks as well. Just a bunch of quarterbacks that hadn't been performing well, but we had hoped with the schedule they could produce. And now with all of those quarterbacks no longer an option, I joked with you earlier on Sunday that we might only talk about one quarterback because all of the other quarterbacks we liked weren't there. But after the injuries to multiple quarterbacks, it became apparent that we did need to talk about at least a couple quarterbacks. So I think Aaron Rodgers is the top option off the waiver wire this week if you do need, particularly that Patrick Mahomes replacement. Rodgers over the past 2 weeks has been playing fairly well, putting up a lot of fantasy points, particularly this past week. Rodgers, someone who realizes probably that he is fighting for his job next year, both potentially with the Jets or with anyone else in the league. So has needed to step up in those situations. Faces the Los Angeles Rams next week, which isn't the perfect matchup for quarterbacks. They did do a great job against the 49ers this past week, but in general, over the season, the Rams have been a more favorable matchup than not. So I think Rodgers can potentially continue his hot streak. It also helps that he has all of his wide receivers now. Allen Lazard has been back these past 2 weeks. So even though Lazard hasn't been seeing a ton of targets, it's still good to see him with all 3 of his wide receivers, which is something he hasn't really had all season long.
Yeah, he's in Rodgers, like he's quietly played well all year. I mean, obviously it helps to have Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson as his top 2 wide receivers, but he's got like a top 10 passing grade on the year as well. So he's not a bad option here if we could get some nice production like we did obviously this past week. So our other quarterback replacement option is Dallas Cowboys quarterback Cooper Rush, who just had a really nice game on Sunday. It was against Carolina, where he threw for 214 yards and 3 touchdowns. So how are you feeling about Rush right now, Nate?
Feeling better about him than I had been all season. He has slowly but surely been playing better, keeping the Cowboys at least in playoff contention, and has been putting up at least some fantasy points. So a lot of other situations where we don't know who's going to be the starting quarterback, or it's a quarterback like Desmond Ridder last night, who had only been starting a week or two. We at least know Rush is going to be starting, and they face the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next week. 6 of the last 10 teams to face the Buccaneers have finished as a top 7 fantasy quarterback. A lot of great names on that list, but also Bryce Young and Kirk Cousins, 2 guys who aren't consistent fantasy quarterbacks. So at least a chance Rush can be in that range. So I think it's another situation where if you had been starting Mahomes, did not have a backup plan, and it's a deeper league where Aaron Rodgers is not available, Rush is probably the quarterback that I would pivot to.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think I'm gonna have to rely on Cooper Rush in a couple places as well, because Patrick Mahomes injury is a killer. So lastly, Bryce Young, who we've been talking about quite a bit here, as he's been playing really well, had kind of a down game in week 15, but still a solid option as of late, considering his improved play, Nate.
Yeah. The big thing with him is even though he's been putting up enough passing yards to be in that borderline quarterback one range over the last several weeks, he's just been very consistently throwing one passing touchdown. I think he is on a 6-game streak now where he has thrown exactly one passing touchdown. The big thing here is we were just talking about the Buccaneers as a strong opponent for fantasy quarterbacks with Cooper Rush, and Bryce Young faces the Buccaneers in week 17. And that's a team that Young just faced a couple weeks ago, was top 10 fantasy quarterback that week when he faced the Buccaneers. So even though I'm not sure he'll do quite as well the second time around against Tampa Bay, still someone where if you think you might need a quarterback in the fantasy championship weekend or are just looking for insurance for your starting quarterback for that week, that Young is the player that I'd be picking up.
Cool. Yeah, we got a bunch of questions come in here right at the end, but some of them are start sit questions. Do you want to do the start sit question or just
let's pass on the start sit ones just because I'll be doing my rankings in a couple hours and then we'll be a lot more confident in those answers. But any waiver related questions, happy to answer those.
For sure. So Fantasy Sports asks, should I drop Rachaad White for Kendre Miller or Jerome Ford? So we got Kendre Miller at the top of the list. Are you moving on from White for Miller or Ford?
I would not be doing it for Ford. The thing with White is the Buccaneers have a fairly favorable schedule for the run game over these next 2 weeks, facing the Cowboys and then it's the Panthers, so two teams that have allowed a lot of fantasy points to running backs this year. So even though Bucky Irving seems fine at this point, and I expect Irving to have the most rushing yards among the two running backs, I think they are very happy with their two-man running backfield. So I think White can continue to see potentially double-digit carries in those games, continue to make a couple of catches. He has been used plenty around the goal line as well, so decent potential for White to score a touchdown. So I think White is definitely the safest option of the three running backs, but I think it depends. If White has been a starter for you, of who your starting running backs are. If you weren't planning on starting White this week, then I would probably make the switch to Miller just because Miller has that higher upside of being a potential every down back. But if White is someone who you were thinking of putting in your fantasy starting lineup this upcoming week, then I would probably stick with him unless we hear worse news on Alvin Kamara.
Yeah. Okay. And then, well, this one just made me laugh. Bryce Young and Kyler matchup, shortest combined height of two starting quarterbacks in NFL history from Mojal. I don't know how to look that up. I don't know if that's something we track in our database, but could be.
Yeah, we don't have all time because we only go back to 2006, but it is something that can be queried, and I'm sure someone will have that information at some point.
Yeah, there you go. The Short King Bowl. All right. See, Xavier asks, he has Blake Corum as a handcuff. Is it time to drop him to get Kendre Miller or Tyjae Spears?
I think so. I think if you can get a handcuff where the starting running back is currently dealing with some kind of injury, that'll be a lot better than having a handcuff where the running back is completely healthy at this point. Right now, it seems like Kyren Williams is completely fine. So, yeah, there is a chance that Williams suffers an injury this week, in which case Corum would be a potential league winner the following week. But because we already have the injury to Alvin Kamara and Tony Pollard isn't 100%, there's a lot more likelihood that Miller or Spears becomes a fantasy starter in these next 2 weeks than it is Corum becomes a fantasy starter.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, the rest are the start sit questions. Like Nate said, he'll be doing his rankings later today. Those will be out on the site, but you can always ask the questions later on in the YouTube comments, and we can check out Nate's rankings and see how things shake out there and get you answers later on. But that is going to do it for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. Get out to those waiver wires, whether you're looking to add some depth in the fantasy playoffs, block your opponents from getting certain players, or looking for a starter replacement. Stay active. Go win a championship. Nate, thank you for putting this together. As always, before we go, please do remind everybody you have up on pff.com this week.
Sure. Have the recap articles as usual this past week. Also have the waiver wire column, which if there is any news today that impacts the waiver wire rankings or anything like that, I will be adjusting those like I did last week with McCormick's injury. So if you do have more questions later in the day, if things are changing, then definitely check out the article there. I will have the start set article this week. Similar to the past 2 weeks, I will be having it different where I'm more so ranking some of the most borderline players. So if you do have players, like a number of you do in the comments, feel free to reach out. The YouTube is fine. I'll also be on Blue Sky as well as the PFF Discord, taking questions for who are the most borderline start sit players, so I know who to write about in that article. So anyone who has already commented in this chat, I will be including that in the players that I could be writing about this week. But outside of that, I will also be on the PFF Discord on Sunday morning answering start sit questions. And since next week is a little bit weird with the holiday, I will also be more active in our PFF Discord all of next week, making sure everyone has their questions answered before the fantasy championship round.
Good stuff. Yeah. It is a weirder week next week, but we will be back doing the waiver wire show as usual on the Tuesday morning. It's just everything else after that gets a little bit shuffled around, but either way, we'll hopefully have all the content out there that you need for that fantasy championship round. As for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out shortly today. The wide receiver man zone coverage report will be out on Thursday. IDP rankings as well as the O-line D-line matchup article will be out, and then in the podcast feed, IDP preview show will be out on Thursday morning as usual, and our start sit show with Nick Bodiford will also be out later on Thursday. So good luck to everybody in week 2 of the fantasy football playoffs, and until next time, peace out.